Having said all these, we now move towards the chapter 3, which is entitled The Role of Pond Isolation, Distance and Direction in the Colonization Pattern of Weak and Strong Dispersers, that is currently under review in freshwater biology. We have said that the wildfire affects species according to their dispersal abilities, that temporal succession has a stronger role, but the temporal succession has a stronger role than the wildfire itself. This is tightly linked with this filling and drying dynamics that the temporary ponds have. So that, as we have commented, influences strongly species traits or functional capacities. In this case, we have seen that according to your dispersal ability, you can be more or less compromised in relation to wildfire effects. This means that dispersal appears as a key role or a key modulator of post-disturbance effects. But the location within the network and, for example, how central you are or how isolated you are from a network can change dispersal dynamics or the dispersal influence in your system. And this is something that has not been addressed yet in our systems. However, in the case of the Alberta, what we see is that our ponds, these bigger circles, are located in a really central location of our network, whereas Guils de Cerdanya ponds are more evenly distributed across the isolation centrality gradient. As you can see, the bigger circles are red and purple colored, which imply that they are really central, whereas in Guils de Cerdanya we see greenish colors and purple colors, which imply that the available to sample ponds are evenly distributed throughout this gradient. So we decided to go to Guils de Cerdanya in order to develop our field experiment where we used mesocosms to carry it. And then we classified organisms according to their dispersal abilities, but only taking into account weak and strong active dispersers. So we have defined our main wide regional scale, which is the centrality isolation gradient. But when talking about network structure and landscape relevance, we have also to account with other small regional scales. In this case, direction, because it's not the same to fly towards a dense area than to fly towards nowhere, and also distance, because it's not the same to fly between two closer ponds than to fly between two distant ponds. So, having these two main factors, we selected one central and one isolated ponds and set up and locate our mesocosms across different locations around these ponds. We then sampled these mesocosms across the whole hydro period of these two ponds that lasted 9 weeks, and we sampled weekly these mesocosms, taking 1 liter of this mesocosm, filtering and returning the water in it. Then, at the 10th week, once these ponds were completely dry, we sampled or filtered the whole mesocosms in order to analyze the whole community that had been formed across time. So, in order to test or analyze these two factors, we designed this experiment where we selected one central and one isolated ponds and then placed our mesocosms at different locations. The first organized in sets conformed of 4 mesocosms each. The first set was the control set and was placed at 10 meters from the ponds. And then, in order to test only for direction, we placed another set of mesocosms that we called the between set, that was placed at the same distance, so 10 meters from the pond, but in direction towards the neighbor closer pond. Similarly, in order to account for distance, we placed the distance set 100 meters away from the pond and in the same direction than the control set, in order to account only with the distance factor. So with this, we analyzed the colonization trends, accounting with the abundance of weak and the abundance of strong dispersers separately, and then for the community assembly, we accounted with weak and strong dispersers also separately. For the colonization trends, we analyzed these trends with a generalized additive mixed model and a model selection procedure, and for the community assembly, an NMDS and a Permanova tests. So going now to the results, and in relation to the colonization threats, only accounting with direction, so comparing the between set and the control set, of course, of the two locations, we saw that for weak active dispersers, the change in abundance across time was only mediated by being central or being isolated. In this case, being central sites, presenting central sites greater abundances than isolated ones. However, for strong active dispersers, the change in abundance across time was also influenced by the direction and taking into account the joined effect of the two between sets, creating an in-between trend of the central and the isolated control sets. So here, direction also has their role in determining species colonization. When taking into account distance and therefore comparing only distance sets and the control sets of the two studied locations, what we saw is that for weak active dispersers, distance has also a role, as well as the wide regional scale, centrality, isolation, creating again a joined for the two distance sets trend in between the two main detected ones. For the strong active dispersers, what we saw is only a relevant role of wide regional scale. So being central or isolated is what determines your colonization trends, your change in abundance across time, being the central sites the ones that presented higher abundance values. In the case of community assembly, I'm taking into account all the sets together of the two locations, we saw that for weak active dispersers, only wide regional scales matter in determining the species composition, and for strong active dispersers the same. Only wide regional scales, so being central or isolated, matter in determining community composition of our mechanisms. So if we try to sum up all this information, what we saw is that the colonization trends, we have our two regional scales, and for the colonization trends, what we saw is that weak active and strong active disperser were both influenced by this scale, and that being central gives you more abundant values. In the case of the small regional scales, what we saw is that distance only was relevant for weak active disperser trends, and in the case of direction, it was only relevant for strong active disperser trends. In the case of community assembly, what we saw is that it influences, being central or isolated, influences community composition of both groups, but when accounting with the small regional scales here, they don't play any role. So that wide regional scales seem to have more relevance than the small regional scales, although depending on your dispersal capacity, you can be more or less influenced by distance and direction. So the location within the network determines the dispersal trend or the colonization trends on our studied communities, and this is something that can be extrapolated to having sampled central ponds located in a central location of the network that has been affected by a wildfire.